The night before they came for him, he signed 3 asylum approvals, dismissed 2 federal wiretap warrants, and booked a one-way flight under a name that wasn't his. By morning, the courtroom seat of the Honorable Federal Judge Harlan Voss was empty. His robe still hung on the hook behind his chamber's door. His coffee mug was still warm. But Judge Harlan Voss was already gone. What federal investigators uncovered in the 72 hours that followed would shake the foundations of the United States federal judiciary. Not just one corrupt official. Not just one bribed ruling. What they found was a systematic, decade-long conspiracy. A sitting federal judge who had quietly become the most valuable asset in the Western Hemisphere for a criminal empire known internally as the Atlantic Offshore Syndicate, a shadow organization built not on street violence, but on paperwork, precedent, and the power of the gavel. This is the story of how one man in a black robe nearly made a cartel untouchable, and how, in a rain-soaked neighborhood on the south side of Buenos Aires, Argentina, it all came apart. Stay with this. Because the deeper it goes, the worse it gets. It began on a Tuesday. 3:47 in the morning. Miami, Florida. The city was quiet in the way Miami almost never is. The neon reflections of Brickell Avenue shimmered on the wet pavement below. A storm had rolled through 2 hours earlier, leaving the streets slick and empty. The air smelled like salt water and exhaust. 3 blocks from the federal courthouse, a light still burned in a 4th-floor parking structure. That is where the FBI's Joint Financial Crimes Task Force had been running surveillance for 11 days straight. When the signal came, it came fast. 12 federal agents in black tactical gear moved from 3 different directions simultaneously. 2 vehicles, nondescript dark SUVs, rolled without headlights into the structure's lower level. A 3rd team was already positioned at the service entrance. A 4th was covering the rooftop access point. No lights. No sirens. No announcements. This was not that kind of operation. Inside a rented commercial van on level 3, agents found 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 were mid-level couriers for the Atlantic Offshore Syndicate. On the van's floor, 4 sealed waterproof cases containing bundled wire transfer documentation, 31 falsified asylum application packets bearing court, verified federal stamps, and 2 encrypted satellite phones. One of the phones, still active, had placed a call 11 minutes earlier. The call had gone to an offshore routing number in the Cayman Islands, but the call's origin, traced in real time by FBI cyber analysts, had pinged from inside a residential tower 6 blocks away. A building where federal judge Harlan Voss kept a private second residence that appeared in no public disclosure filing, listed under the name of a shell corporation called Meridian Coastal Holdings, LLC. When agents reached the residence 14 minutes later, the apartment was empty. A glass of whiskey sat half-finished on the kitchen counter. The bedroom closet had been cleared in a hurry. Hangers on the floor, a single dress shoe left behind. His passport, his real passport, was still in the safe. He'd left it intentionally. Because he had others. By 6 dull that morning, FBI Assistant Director for Criminal Investigations convened an emergency command session at the Miami field office. The room was tense in the way that rooms get when experienced federal investigators realize the scale of what they are looking at has just expanded beyond their original model. Analysts from the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit projected a network diagram on the main screen. The operation had an internal code name now, Project Undertow. What filled that screen was not a drug cartel in any traditional sense. No territorial commanders, no street-level enforcers, no cartel sicarios cutting corners off highways. The Atlantic Offshore Syndicate operated in a different dimension entirely. Shell companies. 47 of them, spread across the Cayman Islands, Panama, Uruguay, and Cyprus. Ghost law firms registered in Delaware with no physical offices. A chain of immigration consulting businesses operating in Miami, Houston, and Newark under the umbrella brand name Patriot Path Solutions. 3 sham nonprofit foundations, 2 of them claiming to serve displaced migrant families, 1 claiming to fund rural legal aid clinics across Florida and Georgia. Every organization connected, every dollar traceable, if you knew where to look. And at the center of the diagram, authorized, verified, digitally signed by a cryptographic key that matched the certificate on file for Judge Harlan Voss's official federal chambers account, was something investigators would later describe in private briefings as the architecture of engineered immunity. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. Judge Voss had spent 11 years on the federal bench. In that time, he had personally presided over more than 300 immigration and financial crimes cases connected to individuals and entities within the Atlantic offshore syndicates network. The analysis was devastating in its precision. 41 wiretap authorization requests denied. 19 asset freeze petitions dismissed on procedural technicalities. 67 asylum applications for known syndicate-connected individuals approved, often within 48 hours, far faster than standard processing timelines. Each approval issued with a judicial seal that made the holder nearly untouchable under U.S. immigration enforcement law. The syndicate had not bribed a judge, they had installed one. His financial records, cracked from encrypted drives seized in the parking structure raid, showed payments totaling more than $14 million over 9 years. Routed through 7 layers of corporate obfuscation, laundered through a Miami Beach restaurant group, a Coral Gables real estate development fund, and 2 bogus green energy grant programs that had received no-bid contracts from a municipal infrastructure board. The money moved like water through sand. By the time it reached Voss, it looked like consulting income. Investment returns, rental revenue from properties he technically co-owned through trusts so layered that an audit would take months just to map. This is not negligence, this is engineered treason. And the operation had barely begun. 5:55 in the morning, 72 hours after the parking structure raid. The FBI's Southeast Regional Command Center in Doral, Florida, lit up like a war room. 3 walls of screens. A central digital map of the continental United States and the upper half of South America. Dozens of red location markers pulsing across Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. More markers across Atlanta. Newark. Houston, 2 blinking steadily off the coast. 1 near Nassau in the Bahamas, 1 near the port city of Montevideo, Uruguay. The commander on the floor, a 23-year FBI veteran named Special Agent Director Carla Mendenhall, looked at the map and said 4 words to her team. We take it all. Operation Undertow moved into its second and decisive phase at 6:11 that morning. Over 900 federal agents, FBI, D, ICE, and DG's Homeland Security Investigations personnel deployed simultaneously across 14 locations. 4 SWAT teams, 2 Coast Guard cutters repositioned offshore in coordinated maritime support, a D8's air surveillance unit running a surveillance drone loop over the port of Miami, DIA units embedded with local law enforcement in 3 states. In Miami's Wynwood district, agents hit a mixed-use commercial building that had served for 6 years as the syndicate's primary document fabrication hub. Inside, industrial-grade printing equipment, federal seal replication hardware, 32 completed fake identity packages, and a server room running what analysts later called one of the most sophisticated case monitoring systems they had ever encountered. The syndicate had been tracking active federal investigations in real time, monitoring docket filings, court scheduling data, and law enforcement movement logs fed to them by compromised insiders. The system had likely given Voss and his handlers advance notice of the arrest warrant the night it was signed. That is how he knew to run. Simultaneously, in a commercial warehouse complex near the port of Miami, registered to a logistics firm called Blue Tide Freight International, itself a ghost subsidiary of a syndicate-connected holding group in Panama, agents seized 3 shipping containers awaiting manifest clearance. Inside, $23 million in shrink-wrapped currency. 12 encrypted communication servers, and 340 kilograms of cocaine, not the core business of the Atlantic offshore syndicate, but proof of the inevitable convergence. When you build an empire on financial invisibility and judicial protection, other cartels come looking for the umbrella. The DIA team lead on scene radioed back one line. They were running a full service shelter for anyone who could pay. In Coral Gables, federal agents executed a warrant on the private offices of Meridian Coastal Holdings. The managing attorney on record, named Denton Ferris, was arrested at his home at 6:44 that morning, still in his pajamas. He said nothing. His attorney, one of 4 on retainer, paid for through a syndicate-connected legal defense fund, arrived within 30 minutes. In the building's basement storage, agents found a fireproof archive room. Floor to ceiling. 11 years of sealed files. Every case, every payment, every authorization, every name. Someone had been keeping records, not for legal compliance, for leverage. In Newark, an ICE tactical unit moved on a residential complex that had functioned as a transit processing hub for syndicate-affiliated asylum seekers. Individuals who had paid the network between $40,000 and $120,000 for full-service immigration packages, fake documentation, pre-coached asylum testimony, embedded legal representation, and a pre-arranged judicial queue that almost always routed their cases to one specific federal courtroom, Judge Harlan Voss's courtroom. 19 individuals were detained at the Newark site. 41 more asylum cases connected to the network were flagged for immediate judicial review across 4 federal districts. By noon, the tally was significant. Over $47 million in seized assets. The cocaine from the port. Communication infrastructure dismantled across 3 states. 31 arrests, and a growing list of compromised individuals inside the system itself that was making the senior investigators in the Doral Command Center go very quiet. The underworld took more damage in 6 hours than it had in 6 years. But Judge Voss was still out there. Inside the FBI's Cyber Forensics Division at the Miami field office, analysts had been working through the night and into the following day on the encrypted contents of the servers seized from the Wynwood Document Hub. What they reconstructed was the blueprint of something that investigators began calling the Second Judiciary, a parallel legal processing system that operated in the shadow of the real one. The syndicate had not needed to corrupt the entire court system. They only needed one judge in the right position, with jurisdiction over the right case types in the right geographic corridor. Miami was not chosen by accident. It is one of the highest volume federal immigration dockets in the country. It is a global financial transit city. It has port infrastructure, international banking relationships, and a long institutional history of complex money movement. The Atlantic Offshore Syndicate had identified this 20 years ago and had spent a decade building toward the moment when they would have a fully installed asset on the federal bench. The forensic trail showed the first contact between syndicate financial operatives and a then law partner Harlan Voss dated back 13 years. A series of consulting agreements. A lucrative referral relationship. A quiet real estate co-investment. Small hooks set carefully over time, each one pulling a little tighter, until by the time Voss was appointed to the federal bench, the relationship was too deep to sever and too valuable to abandon. Within the seized servers, analysts found an internal syndicate communication, encrypted but cracked, that described Voss using the codename, the Seal, a reference to the federal judicial seal that authenticated his rulings. In one message between 2 senior syndicate figures, the seal holds, "No convoy touches a docket, no asset gets frozen. The corridor stays open." The corridor. That word appeared repeatedly. Analysts mapped it, a financial and legal movement corridor running from South America, primarily Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, through Caribbean banking infrastructure into Miami, and then dispersing through shell company networks into the broader U.S. financial system. Money laundering on a continental scale. Asylum fraud as a human supply chain, judicial protection as the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. Inside patrol logs and court scheduling records, investigators found something that hit the honest law enforcement personnel in that room like a physical blow. 32 instances over 4 years where ICE enforcement operations in Miami-Dade County had been quietly redirected or delayed, traced to internal coordination with a deputy scheduling official in the local field office who had been on syndicate payroll, patrol grids falsified, raid timing leaked. 4 separate federal operations against syndicate-connected targets had been burned before they launched because someone inside had warned the network. 3 active ICE agents, 1 federal court clerk, 1 assistant U.S. attorney whose case assignments had been subtly manipulated for 2 years. The badge, the robe, the seal. All of it had been rented. Senior agents who had spent their careers in federal law enforcement described the feeling in the room as one of the most professionally devastating moments they had ever experienced, not because they were surprised that corruption existed, but because of the precision, the patience, the scope. This was not a second criminal network inside law enforcement. This was a second law enforcement network built by the criminal one. It would be rebuilt. But first, it had to be fully exposed. He had moved fast. Give him that. From the residential tower in Miami, Judge Harlan Voss had taken a pre-arranged private car to a private aviation terminal at a small general aviation airport northwest of the city. Not Miami International, not Fort Lauderdale, a terminal that handled charter flights with minimal federal customs interaction for outbound private passengers, and which, investigators now confirmed, had been flagged twice in previous years for irregular customs documentation. He flew first to Nassau, Bahamas, then, via a second charter under a different identity, to Sao Paulo, Brazil, then a commercial flight segment, business class, under a third identity, to Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had a safe house. He had money waiting. He had contacts within a local legal network in Argentina that the Atlantic Offshore Syndicate had cultivated over years as a soft landing infrastructure for compromised assets who needed to disappear. He had thought of everything, except for the fact that the FBI's International Operations Division had been in contact with Argentina's Federal Investigation Agency, the AFI, for 18 months prior, in connection with an entirely separate investigation into syndicate money flows through Buenos Aires' banking infrastructure. That relationship had already produced a memorandum of cooperation. When the alert went out on Voss, the channel was already open. It took 41 hours. In a residential neighborhood in the southern district of Buenos Aires, Pompeia, a working-class barrio of low brick buildings and narrow streets where no one was likely to look for a disgraced American federal judge, Argentine federal agents and 2 embedded FBI International Operations agents moved on a rented safe-house apartment at 11:22 at night, local time. The street outside was quiet. A dog barked somewhere 2 blocks over. A single streetlight cast yellow across wet cobblestones. 2 men were watching the building's front from a parked car. They were detained without incident. Inside the apartment, on the second floor, Harlan Voss was found seated at a small table. Laptop open. A glass of red wine. He had apparently been in the process of composing a message, to whom investigators would later work to determine. He was dressed as though he had not fully unpacked. A single bag sat by the bedroom door. He did not run. He did not speak. He looked at the agents in the doorway for a long moment with the measured expression of a man who had spent a lifetime reading courtrooms. Then he placed both hands flat on the table. Argentine authorities took him into custody at 11:31 p.m. local time. The formal extradition request from the United States Department of Justice was transmitted within the hour. It was pre-drafted. Investigators had been ready. At the Miami field office, when the confirmation came through, the room did not erupt. There were no celebrations. The agents who had worked this case through 72 sleepless hours simply looked at each other, because they knew what was still ahead. The prosecutions, the hearings, the appeals, the years of dismantling what had been built, and the question that none of them could fully answer yet: how many other SEALs were still in place? Here is what the Atlantic Offshore Syndicate built in real terms. Not in legal abstractions. In human cost, billions of dollars laundered through institutions and shell structures that drained legitimate tax and regulatory infrastructure. Dozens of individuals granted fraudulent asylum, some with legitimate humanitarian needs exploited as cover, others with criminal histories that the syndicate's legal processing system deliberately obscured, corruption implanted in federal law enforcement, in the judiciary, in the administrative machinery of immigration processing, and underneath it, the financial arteries that fed the broader criminal ecosystem. The cocaine seized at the port was not an accident. Organizations that need a protected financial corridor eventually use it for everything. The Atlantic Offshore Syndicate had become, investigators concluded, the single most effective money laundering and legal protection infrastructure serving international criminal networks on the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. Cartels, trafficking networks, sanctioned oligarchs, and criminal financiers from multiple continents had all used the corridor, had all benefited from the seal. Neighborhoods in Miami's lower-income corridors, where fentanyl and cocaine have taken staggering tolls over the past decade, exist in part because networks like this one keep the financial and logistical pipelines operational. The money gets clean, the people moving it stay protected, and the communities absorbing the downstream damage get no protection at all. Families who lost someone to a fentanyl overdose, to trafficking, to the violence that clusters around narcotic corridors, They were not abstractions in the FBI command center that week. Their names, their cases, their neighborhoods were what the agents working Project Undertow quietly carried with them through every hour of that investigation. Power does not always need violence. Sometimes it only needs silence, patience, and the right signature on the right document. That is the lesson of Judge Harlan Voss. That is the warning of the Atlantic Offshore Syndicate. A criminal organization does not need to conquer a system. It only needs to become indistinguishable from one. If you are still watching, you already understand why this story matters. Tap like so that more people see how deep organized crime can reach into the institutions that are supposed to protect them. Comment expose if you believe that political and judicial corruption should be dragged into the open regardless of how high it goes. Share this with someone who still thinks the court system is beyond this kind of reach. The rebuilding of what was compromised, the vetting, the audits, the institutional reform will take years. Some of it will happen in public, most of it will not. That work is less cinematic than a Buenos Aires arrest in the rain. But it is the harder, more important part. Harlan Voss is in custody. The syndicates network is fractured, the corridor is disrupted. But the question investigators are already asking, in quiet rooms, over coffee, looking at new network diagrams, is simple and chilling. How long had the next one been in place before anyone noticed the first?